Hey, good afternoon. It's a nice gray day up here in Pennsylvania, and just going to very quickly talk a little bit, as I promised, about the culture of the car. Uh, which is something that I like to use as an example. It's not the only major change that takes place in the mid 20th century. We could talk about the culture of Disney or of television. We could talk about any number of things. But to me, the car is just one of the fun things that we can do, we can talk on, and makes a great essay question for the final. Hint, hint, as I've told everybody. So, let's talk a little bit about the culture of the car. When I talk about, sort of the culture of an object like a car, what am I getting at? Well, I'm getting at the notion that the car changes the way people behave, the way that they live, and the way that they think about the world around them. In the case of the car, one of its major changes is that it brings people closer together, and it brings a sense of the shrinking of the world, if that makes sense. This notion that we're no longer separated in time and space in quite the same way that we have been prior. Now, of course, the car existed in the 1920s, and you had Calvin Coolidge's famous adage, a chicken for every pot and a car in every garage. That was his dream for the country. So we can certainly talk about the car in previous decades, but after World War II, all of these different factors come together, that the cost of production is going down, the buying power and purchasing power of people is going up, and there's a bunch of innovations in other areas, for example, in infrastructure and such, that are lending themselves to the car's virtual explosion in culture. So let's talk for a few moments about a couple of things that I think are crucial. I had said, if you want to sit down and you want to put together your own list, do so. I'm going to hit on a couple of things that I think are kind of crucial. One is the demographic shift. In prior decades and in previous eras, wherever you worked, you needed to live very close by. Most people didn't really travel outside of their hometown or their home area, very often, if at all. Many people would never leave within, say, 20 miles of the place that they had been born. But with the car coming, that's going to change. And one of the ways it'll change is in terms of work. Previously, many of the good jobs were in the cities. And so you had to build your factory in the city. And the people who worked there had to live in the city. And that meant there were lots of stores, shops, churches, restaurants, mechanics, seamstresses, all kinds of different services, had to be there in the city. Had to be close to where the people lived. But with the advent of the car, people will be able to move out of the city if they so choose, and many people will do so. But what kind of people? Well, they have to be able to afford it, which means upper class and middle class folks. But most of the upper and middle class folks are white. So you're going to get this exodus of white folk from the inner cities. Now, we certainly don't want to pretend that somehow you need white people in a certain place for it to be good, But what you do need is a tax base. You need people with money to pay taxes in a given area. And then those taxes go to fund, fixing the streets, providing social services, all those things that cities and towns and such do for us. Schools, hospitals, whatnot. So with lots of people with money moving out, white middle class, white upper class, moving out of the city into small towns around the city and suburbs. This is the rise of the suburb, right? With that taking place, what's left in the city? Lower class whites, poor whites, and minorities. Oftentimes I'll get the question from people, how did the urban problem, quote, come to be? How did the inner city get, quote, so bad? Okay, fine. It's a perfectly fair question. Inner cities are notoriously high poverty, high crime. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that somehow it was, a planned out thing where a bunch of evil white people sat down and said, we're going to leave the city together and we're going to leave it a mess. It was just economic forces at work. That as people were able to move out and did so, what they left behind was high concentrations of poverty. With high concentrations of poverty come high concentrations of crime. In addition to the poverty, because these people had left, many of the stores and services were no longer needed or were no longer sustainable. You don't really need a high-end restaurant in the middle of a city where people can't afford to eat there. That place will either move out into the suburbs with these folks, or it'll go under, it'll close. Same thing for high-end clothiers, high-end shops and stores that sell fresh produce, great butcher shops, even wealthy churches will move. What's left will be things that cater to a lower income group of people. And, so you're going to get a lot of bars, a lot of convenience stores, sort of the corner shop that cashes checks and sells the basic goods that a person might need, but doesn't really sell good, fresh, quality produce and food and such. So this is something that takes place. And we call this white flight, but it gives rise to the suburbs. So what does it mean when we give rise to the suburbs? Well, it means that we're going to build roads back into the city, because we still do have to come back into the city to work oftentimes. So major thoroughfares will be built. If you think about the geography of a place like Harrisburg or York or Lancaster, you'll see these kinds of roads. All roads lead into the city. Why? Because people had to get back to the city to conduct business, but then they had to get out of the city to go home to where they lived. The other thing that it will do is it will cause a number of new businesses to pop up in the suburbs. Where do you put those businesses? Well, there's no existing infrastructure there. This is going to give rise to the strip mall. It's just going to seem like an efficient way of grouping together businesses, right? You build a big strip of properties, subdivide them out, rent those spaces out to merchants, restaurants, stores, whatever, offices, you're going to get these kinds of things. Office parks, that whole concept of a sort of office park is going to develop during this time period. So it's interesting the way that this plays into not just the shift in where people live, but the shift in how people live on an everyday basis, right? It's going to change the way that they shop, the way that they work, the way that they worship. Churches will move into those regions, and so you'll get the sort of suburban church versus urban church and the differences in style and the kind of people that they serve. Other factors, with this change, okay, it's going to cause more travel time, right? So the idea of a drive-through restaurant or a drive-in restaurant is going to grow. Ray Kroc did not found McDonald's from scratch. He purchased it, but he's widely known as the person who popularized it, right? This sort of restaurant that you can just get in, get out very quickly, get your food. It's consistent. It's the same every time, and it's the same everywhere. That's going to be seen as a good thing. Today, there's this movement towards, buying local, buying fresh, kind of focusing on that kind of thing. But again, that's a fairly modern thing. For the most part, back then, the thought process was we want, consistent quality and consistent ease of access. And that makes sense, Yes, it turned in the 90s and 2000s, where people started shifting back to wanting more local, more authentic, more unique, rather than just Red Lobster, Olive Garden, TGI Fridays, Applebee's, kind of chain joints, right? But those chain joints got popular for a reason, right? They got popular because it was something that people demanded, that people wanted. So those things are going to rise during this time. Now that people are living outside the city, they're going to need entertainments outside the city. And so you'll get the outside the city shopping malls. You'll get the outside the city movies, right? Drive-in theaters is a big thing that comes about during this period. Drive-in theaters, you roll in, tune the radio to a certain station, and you can hear the audio being played. Okay, great. This is going to play into a sort of second piece, and that is the rise of car culture has a huge impact on the changes that are taking place in young people's lives. The rise of sort of the idea of the teenager. Again, this development had started really in the 1920s, but it's going to grow in the 1950s. And in large part, that's going to be because cars are going to give young people the ability to get away from adult supervision, which can be beneficial and can be hazardous at times, but young people are going to spend time together rather than with adults. And so you're going to get the drive-in, theater, the drive-in restaurant. If you've ever watched the old TV show Happy Days with the Fonz, that's certainly something that they sort of focus on there. These kids going to this place in order to get away from their parents, to spend time together, to enjoy each other's company. Part of this is the teenage sort of mating ritual, if you want to go anthropologically talking about it that way. You can talk about sort of teenage mating practices, how dating becomes a thing here, going steady, that kind of image, that kind of thing, starts taking place. Drive-in theaters, will provide privacy. It's just you and your date in the car, alone. And it's dark. And I think that's all we need to say. Back in the 1920s, a famous preacher had called cars brothels on wheels, And while we can laugh about that and such or whatever, there is a significant rise in teenage sexual activity during this period, as they simply have the opportunity to do so. Oftentimes, some cultural critics will point to, this loosening of morals and whatnot. I'm not convinced that people, all of a sudden just wanted sex more or something. I think that people had an opportunity more, and particularly young hormonal teenagers. They had the opportunity and they took advantage of it. But certainly this is going to help fuel the baby boom that takes place in the 1950s. These young people who are, finding themselves in these situations, where there is no supervision and one thing leads to another, and there's no birth control pill yet. Contraception in many places is illegal at this point. And so you're going to have in the 1950s this baby boom and a lot of shotgun weddings, this sort of wedding because the girl's pregnant and the boy will, quote, do the right thing and will marry her to take care of her and their child. And honestly, you're going to find some very unhappy marriages as a result of this. A lot of people very dissatisfied with their relationships because they married for sort of practical reasons and cultural reasons rather than out of any sense of love or any sense of real duty or commitment. There's a lot of pressure there. So that's part of it, and I think by the end of the 50s, when we see Betty Friedan's famous book, The Feminine Mystique, and in the 1960s, when we see this push for contraception, we're seeing, in some ways, a reaction to the 1950s and the changes in human sexuality that were taking place as a result. So, that's certainly something to consider with regards to the rise of car culture. The last thing that I want to bring up is, the sort of culture of customization and personalization. If you think about it, when I was young, I had a set of fuzzy dice that hung from the mirror of my car. And I had like little seat covers on the seats of my car, and the most ridiculous, like neon pink, like fuzzy steering wheel cover, right? It was ridiculous. It was absurd. But I thought it was great because it was uniquely and specially me. And it symbolized, for me, my distinctive personality. And so the car is going to, in some situations, become a sort of canvas for people to imprint their own values and their own desires upon. You're going to see the rise of sort of customization to cars, whether it be something as simple as a steering wheel cover or fuzzy dice, or whether it be something as complicated as the flaming hot rod paint jobs, that you sort of famously see in various films and movies. My daughter just pulled out a few seconds ago in her car. She's, I was going to say she's 21. Actually, I think she's still 20. Yeah, a few more months. And when she got her car, she spent an extra $150 or so to have a pinstripe put on the side because it made it her own. And instead of being just the little blue Ford Focus that everybody has, now it's her little blue Ford Focus with a pinstripe. Souping up cars, making them faster, making them more powerful, sort of hot rods and fast cars and such, racing. These things all fit together. You think about things like the film franchise, The Fast and the Furious, right? That whole film franchise is about this impulse, to take a car and make it more than just four wheels and a steering wheel and a means of transportation from point A to point B. It's about trying to make the car something special for yourself. Again, an imprint of your personality on this tool that you use. That is something that is going to grow during the 1950s. And it's going to be available to people in the 1950s in large part because of some other changes that take place. The rise of automotive finance, the idea of borrowing money to buy the car is something that's really going to hit in the 1950s. And so parents will be passing cars down to their children. The expectation was that you would only have a car for a few years, and then you would get rid of it, and you would get a new car. Most car loans back then were 12 months, 24 months, 18 months, somewhere in that range. 36 months, 3 years was a really long loan. Nowadays, sort of 60 months, which is 5 years, 72 months, and even up to 84 months are all pretty standard. So we've obviously stretched that out. But back then, the standard was a very short-term loan. And oftentimes then that used car would be sold or it would be passed on and given to the kids. And then the kids would be able to tear the car apart and rebuild it and do what they wanted to do with it. And this is where you get this sort of hot rodding culture, and the beginning of this sort of street racing kind of culture. We could talk forever about all the different things that cars do and everything that goes into it. But to me, these changes in how people live and where they live, the change in youth culture, particularly youth sexual values and such, and then this culture of customization, these three things are, I think, huge. And I think they're worth talking about and considering and remembering. I'm sure you can come up with others. By all means, do so. But if you have any questions, of course, as always, contact me. And we'll chat about this a little bit more in the future. When we get into the 1980s, we'll talk a little bit more about this stuff. All right? Signing off till then. Bye-bye.